Take a moment and picture a fantasy world. Not Lord of the Rings, not Game of Thrones, but a fantasy world born from your own imagination. Now, I'm willing to bet that your fantasy world looks a little medieval European, something with massive stone castles on hilltops or on cliffs overlooking the ocean, something with small towns with cobbled streets and ramshackle wooden houses. Why is that? Why is it that we always picture something medieval European, but with goblins and orcs and elves and dwarves and dragons? Now, obviously, this isn't always the case. There is steampunk fantasy, there is modern urban fantasy, and there is science fantasy, which is fantasy set in a sci-fi world, the most famous example of this being Star Wars. But medieval European fantasy settings are still the baseline. They are still the expectation. They're still where the mind goes to first. And the answer is pretty obvious, right? It's Tolkien, it's Lord of the Rings. We still take so much influence from the world that he created. And what Tolkien was trying to do was create his own mythology, an entirely fresh and new mythological world. World building is the cornerstone of fantasy fiction, and he did it first. And when we think about mythology, we think about medieval settings, even if that mythology isn't European. We think about Greek and Norse mythology having a kind of medieval or pre-modern setting, but then there's also Chinese and Japanese mythologies, which are also never set in the modern day because that's not where they come from. And so if fantasy is inspired by mythology and the idea behind fantasy is to create your own mythology, at least in part, then it's going to look mythological, therefore it's going to look medieval or something even earlier than that. And I honestly don't really have a point here. I just think it's very, very interesting, but it does make me grateful that this mold is being broken by so many different authors these days. We have so much great, diverse fantasy fiction at our fingertips right now, inspired by African mythology, South American mythology, Indonesian mythology. And I love that that diversity is pushing the fantasy genre forward. It's beautiful to see, and I'm really grateful for it. I always picture a medieval European setting when I think of fantasy, but that is changing. It is getting broader and more beautiful, and I am so here for it.